the slideshow appearing. So yes, we are moving a little bit southward to the Arabian Peninsula with an archaeological excavations which documented the birth and development of religious Islamic architecture in Central Arabia, which is something quite rare until now. And I hope that the fieldwork that we conducted with the Saudi-French archaeological mission in the oasis of al-Kharj filled this gap by discovering and excavating during 5 seasons the congregational mosque of al-Yamāma site. The purpose of my presentation is to show you the results of this excavation, to gain an insight into the development of Islamic religious architecture in the peninsula, and to put this urban monument into context of an early Islamic city. So the excavation we did is only a small part of a wider project, the archaeological mission in al-Kharj, whose purpose was to study the evolution of the settlement pattern and the subsistence strategy from the Paleolithic to the modern period. So we had different excavations on prehistoric, Bronze Age, Iron Age, and pre-Islamic and Islamic sites in the entire oasis. All the reports are available online. Just a quick word on the geographical context of this oasis of al-Kharj. Al-Kharj is a city located, it's a modern city located 80 kilometers southeast of Riyadh, the capital city of Saudi Arabia. We are in the Najd, on the eastern side of the Jebel Tuwaiq. And you can see on the map on the right, the extension of the surveyed area during the project, which is approximately 100 kilometers from east to west and 50 kilometers from north to south. And what's interesting with that area is that we are in an arid or hyper-arid climate zone with almost no rain. However, the funnel-shaped area of al-Kharj is receiving different subterranean waters, the underground wadi flows going through the Jebel Tuwaiq from the west and from the north with the Wadi Hanifa from the south, so that a lot of water is available in the ground. And there is also in the Red Star an artesian spring providing fresh water in this area. And the most impressive features are the sinkholes. You have a picture here on the right side down. You can see houses and cars nearby showing you the size of these sinkholes here from a closer look. And of course, today it's karstic formation, geological formation, natural one. Today it's empty because there have been heavy mechanical pumping during the last 50 years. However, on the picture of the 70s from the Aramco found, you can see that there was water in these sinkholes, and we can also see some pictures of field in the 20s. And there were filled in with water all year long during the pre-Islamic and Islamic period, providing fresh water to the population of the oasis. So in this frame, we are in an arid region with accessible water, and therefore there are plenty of archaeological sites in that area. This is the result of the survey we did with the yellow sites, which are prehistoric sites, the blue one, Bronze and Iron Age necropolises, and the red sites are the late pre-Islamic, early Islamic settlements. And the one we are focusing on today is the site of al-Yamāma, also called sometimes al-Banna, just north of the modern city of al-Kharj. So this site was the main focus of our project, and it's the widest archaeological site of the entire oasis. It's approximately 1 kilometer from north to south and 500 meters from east to west. You can see on this plan, as well as in the aerial picture, that a lot of mud brick walls are outcropping on the surface of the site. These correspond to the latest occupation of the site, which is the late Islamic period. And to gain an insight and have knowledge of the period of occupation of the site, we excavated several areas in soundings, 1, 2, 3, and 4, as well as an extensive excavation at the top of the mound on the site, where we excavated the congregational mosque I will talk about in detail. So beside the mosque, we excavated open air occupation, domestic context, a pottery workshop. I will talk rapidly about it later. And the results of all these soundings and excavation provided a chronological frame for the occupation of the site. So we have clearly at least 3 periods of occupation. One is pre-Islamic, the 4th and 3rd century BCE. A second occupation is the early Islamic one, which will be the main part of my presentation. And we also have a late Islamic occupation over most of the site. Now, there is this mosque that we excavated, and I will present you the results of this excavation as we discovered them in the process of the digging. So starting from the late Islamic mosque and going down to the early Islamic mosque. Firstly, the mosque was discovered by chance, since we started deep sounding on the edge of the mound north of the site. You can see an aerial picture of this sounding done in 2011. And in the southern part of this sounding, we discovered a monumental building with 2 massive columns. And then we decided to expand the excavation of that area. And we unearthed this well-preserved and wide mosque on the site of al-Yamāma. So this is the picture after the last excavation season in 2016, where you can see the entire building with an enclosure divided between an open air area, an open air courtyard to the east, and a covered prayer hall to the west. The entire building is 41 meters from east to west and 29 meters from north to south. And the prayer hall is then 29 by 12 meters wide. You can see the 3 lines of huge circular pillars running parallel to the Qibla walls, supporting a roof. And there were 2 mihrabs, 1 square mihrab and 1 horseshoe mihrab, second one, in the thickness of the wall. There is also an interesting feature, which is the remains of a portico riwak to the north of the courtyard. In this building, we identified at least 4 successive major periods of occupation, each one being characterized by a floor. The most ancient one, coming back, yes, the first one is characterized by a beautiful plaster floor, which is called F15. And this floor is very important. We will see this later, because the columns and the walls that you can see on this picture are built above this floor. The floor is not building the walls and the columns, but it goes below these structures. So this is the first occupation of this, what I call the late Islamic mosque, the building 1. And then the the prayer hall sanded up slightly. It was filled in with sand, and we can see different levels of different crust, successive crusts of hardened sand with footprints, with palm leaf mat prints on the sand. So this is the second occupation. Then we have a third occupation with the same kind of prints on the sand, and the last one with the same kind of prints as well. And the dating of all this occupation was done by C14 dating of charcoals, as well as by the artifacts, very few artifacts that we discovered in contexts, which are mainly glass bangles, the D-shaped gunflint, the lead musket bullets, the Batavian ware, which is very characteristic kind of glazed ware, the fruitware, and the clay pipe bowl, this Ottoman pipe. So it clearly dates from the mid-15th to the very early 19th century. This is a kind of restitution which has been done by the late architect Christian Dahl, who proposed this kind of restitution based on comparisons with historical mosques preserved in the region of the Najd, with these kill arches resting on these columns. And in the courtyard, together with a fallen column in mud brick of the portico, we discovered this kind of crow-stepped capital showing the kind of kill arches we could have above the columns. So I'm just, yes, waiting for the next slide. So now I'm turning to the most interesting thing for the purpose of this workshop, the Early Islamic Mosque, located exactly at the same spot. Well, in the process of the excavation, we discovered this beautiful plaster floor I mentioned before, the floor F15, above which all the walls and columns of the late Islamic mosque were built. And a closer look at this plaster floor showed several leveled structures. You can see some pillars on the top right pictures in mud brick with plaster floor abutting on the pillars. You can see also a column on the lower left picture and a wall with buttresses on the lower right pictures. And we started to map all these remains, these leveled remains. So on this plan, you have in light gray the late Islamic mosque, and then on dark gray, all these leveled structures. And if we isolate these structures, we can see the plan of a previous mosque just below the late Islamic one, which has been called Building 3. And interestingly, there were pits dug in the plaster floor for the reuse of building material in the latest occupation of the building. And while emptying these pits, we can have an insight into the stratigraphy of this early Islamic mosque. And we can see, in fact, 3 successive plaster floors belonging to the early Islamic mosques. One is called 192, 182, and the F15. So this is a picture of these different successive plaster floors, all belonging to this early Islamic mosque. We have only a very thin stratigraphy for this building. Nevertheless, it has been possible to date this occupation. I will show this later. But just would like to present what could have been at least the second and third phases of this early Islamic mosque with the remains we have. In the second phase, building 3-2, we have an interesting feature visible in the floor. It looks like a kind of long crack on the ground with this groove shape pattern along the crack. And in fact, it proved to be, or it likely was, the setting for a wooden screen, what is called the maksura, closing the prayer hall in two parts. This is a kind of feature which is attested in several early Islamic mosques in Basra, in Kufa, in Damascus, and Fustat, and which was mainly used to reserve the specific area for the sovereign or a governor on a city. So this is a kind of interesting feature that we could have in that mosque. And then in the third phase of the early Islamic mosque, then this is the plaster floor, F15. And on the plaster floor, there is an interesting feature. This is a kind of detail, but I like to show this because it provides some idea of the life that happened in the mosque. These are game boards. There are 28 game boards engraved on the plaster floor of different kinds. Chessboards, al-Quirk, this is on the right side, and a kind of mankala game, which is al-Arbatash, 3 lines of 14 cupolas engraved on the plaster. This is a kind of what it looked like in the ground. And this feature, interestingly, is very well attested in churches, cathedrals, castles of Western Europe from the 12th century onwards, as well as in Israel, for example, in Jerusalem, in the Church of the Condemnation. So the al-Quirk game appears in Persian sources in the 10th century and start to spread toward the West in the 11th and 12th century, which could be a kind of indication, terminus postquem for this last floor. Beside this evidence, we also were lucky to discover some fragments of charcoal within the plaster of these floors, and 3 samples could be dated. One comes from the first plaster floor, F192, and luckily this is a fragment of a tamarix branch, so it prevents from an old wood effect that could affect C14 dating. It's much more accurate to have a dating on a small branch rather on a big beam that could have been reused over and over. So it's supposed to be a kind of accurate dating for this sample. And the first floor was dated to the second half of the 7th or first half of the 8th century CE. Then we also dated 2 samples from the 3rd floor, the plaster F15 with the game boards, and the dating provided by the 2 charcoals of palm tree trunk are dated to mostly the 8th and 9th century CE. So this is an indication of a chronological frame for this early Islamic mosque. In the absence of previous architecture on the building spot of that mosque, we can assume that there are no influence nor constraints connected to a previous building. So we have here a kind of picture of what could have been the early Islamic mosque from the Najd and even Central Arabia. The characteristics that we have in al-Yamāma are the projecting mihrab, a partitioning of the inner space, a plaster floor with plaster coating of the lower part of the walls, and also as a detail, the game boards engraved on the floor. And it's interesting to compare the early Islamic mosque of al-Yamāma with other contemporary mosques of Central and Western Arabia. In fact, there are very few examples known so far from archaeology with published plans. The only one we found in the documentation are the Mosque of El-Rabada on the Darb Zubaydah, which is from the 8th or 9th century CE, the Mosque of El-Urdud in the Wadi Najran, southwest of Saudi Arabia, dated to the 7th, 9th century CE. And we can add also two other mosques for which we don't have a very detailed plan, that of Faid in the region of El-Hail, northern Najd, and Jerash in southern Hijaz, which is dated to the 9th and 10th century CE. And we can see that they all share the same kind of architectural features, which could be directly inspired from the early mosque of the Prophet at Medina. These are the rectangular prayer hall, which is often circa 20 to 30 meters wide, 2 to 3 colonnades running parallel to the Qibla wall, the level wooden roofs resting directly on colonnades or piers, the opening of the prayer hall onto the courtyard, the absence of minaret, and from the 8th century onward, a mihrab making projection on the exterior surface of the Qibla wall. So we assume that we can clearly see here the emergence of an homogeneous early Islamic Najdi or Hijazi type of mosque. So now I'm coming to the main question during this workshop, which is the Islamic mosque within its spatial context. What was the early Islamic city of al-Yamāma? And I'm sorry to say that we have very few evidence for this. In the immediate neighborhood of the mosque, we found no early Islamic occupation or early Islamic structures. We excavated a building 2, it was the Sounding 2, which is a domestic occupation of the late Islamic period, as all the structures we can see all around outcropping on the ground. And we also did a trench west of the mosque, where we have two clear successive phases of architectural occupation. One is, again, the late Islamic occupation of the site, 16th, 18th century CE. And below this is the pre-Islamic occupation of the 4th, 3rd century CE. So there is no evidence of an early Islamic occupation right around the mosque so far. And also an interesting thing is that when we emptied the pits within the mosque and dug the trenches, we can see that the mosque is resting above sand. There is no building directly built just below the mosque. So it's not the continuity of a previous building, which could have been either a religious building as a church or a synagogue or a pagan temple, but no, there is nothing below it. So I don't discard the possibility of an early Islamic occupation in the neighborhood, but so far we didn't find it. The only places where we have some evidence of an early Islamic presence is at the bottom of Sounding 4, and I don't display any picture of that because it's just a small area of 1 by 1 meter. It's at the bottom of the Sounding, dug in the sand. It was very dangerous, so we had to reduce the width of the Sounding, and we only have a small area with a hearth, a charcoal dated to the Islamic, early Islamic period, but no architectural features. And we also discovered outside of the fenced area of the site an Islamic pottery workshop, an early Islamic pottery workshop. It's very interesting because it's a wide pottery workshop with several furnaces. We excavated one of them. It's quite a big structure, and there was a local production for jars and bowls mainly. And this pottery workshop was dated to the Abbasid period, let's say the 9th and 10th century CE, according to the C14 dating again, and the rare imports of pottery discovered in this workshop. So this is the only evidence that we have of this early Islamic occupation on the site of al-Yamāma. Now we can turn to the textual sources, and the most important or useful source for us is the Sifat Jazirat al-Arabiya by al-Hamdani from the 10th century, where we have an accurate description of the Arabian Peninsula, the important sites of the peninsula in the 10th century. And thanks to al-Hamdani, it is very likely that the site of al-Yamāma can be identified with a site called Jo al-Khadarim or al-Khidrima, located in the oasis of al-Yamāma, the ancient oasis. So just to make it clear, the site of al-Yamāma, the modern site of al-Yamāma, is called al-Yamāma, but its modern name. And in the past, the name of al-Yamāma designated an entire region, which is the central Arabia. So it's likely an inheritage of this past, but it's only a modern name. The site was not called al-Yamāma in the past. We have several place names for these oases, especially two quoted by al-Hamdani, which are Kharj, today preserved in the modern city, and Jo al-Khadarim, which is the entry in the oasis when coming from al-Bahrain and from the east. And according to this description, it's likely that the archaeological site of al-Yamāma is the ancient Jo al-Khadarim. Now we can, if we assume this identification, we can find some description of this site in different sources. For example, al-Baladuri mentioned that after the death of the Prophet, Muj'a al-Yamāmi came to Abu Bakr, who assigned him as fifth al-Khidrima. So we can see that already at the time of the Prophet, al-Khidrima could have been an important place in Central Arabia. Then we have the Kitab al-Manasik wa Makin from an anonymous author, and there Jo al-Khadarim appears in the list of the main minbars of the Yamama region. Al-Hamdani mentions also al-Khidrima when one is arriving from the east, and he quotes the presence of a town, villages, and souk, where the Banu al-Akhdar, who are the al-Ukhaydir, are living, and several branches of the Banu Hanifa as well. It's interesting because he describes al-Khidrima as a town, villages, and souk, and it seems to correspond to the image we can have of the site through archaeology, which is not as much a densely packed urban fabric, but rather kind of clusters spread in an oasis. I mean, places with dwellings, workshops for the pottery in one place, the big mosque in another one, and possibly dwellings split in several places, as the description seems to refer to with the town and villages and so on. And it's still the case today. I mean, except the modern city of al-Kharj, the occupation in the oasis is rather small villages spread there and there, rather than a big centralized and densely occupied area. And then, just to quote the last reference we could have to the site is in Nasiri Khusro Safarnameh from the 11th century, where he mentions Yamama, and he's talking about the capital city of al-Yamāma. which was Joe al-Khadarim. We know that by al-Hamdani because the Banu al-Khaydir chose the site of Joe al-Khadarim as their capital city. And Nasir al-Khusru then described a great old castle at the foot of which lies the town and the market in which are established craftsmen of all trades. The great mosque is beautiful. The emirs who have long governed this country are descendants of Ali. So if we agree in identifying the sites that I showed you before with the Joe al-Khadarim, we can have small insights of what it probably looked like at the time of the mosque we excavated, but these are very only isolated hints about this. So thank you very much.